Hello and welcome to Direct Initiative, the podcast where we talk about direct democracy and the importance of ballot measures. I'm Alex Kawa, and today we're going to be talking about ranked choice voting. Because a little less than 2 weeks ago, the Oregon State Legislature voted to put ranked choice voting onto the 2024 ballot. The measure, if passed, would require RCV to be used to elect candidates for federal and statewide office in Oregon, including for governor, secretary of state, and Congress. This comes off the heels of the state's latest gubernatorial election, which saw a three-way race that resulted in Democrat Tina Kotek being elected governor with just 47% of the vote. However, it can be thought of as a miracle that she even won the race, given that many polls throughout the summer and early fall of 2022 showed her trailing her Republican opponent owing to the presence of Betsy Johnson, a Democrat turned independent candidate in the race, who was able to poll very high for a third-party candidate, likely stemming from her big money donations, which is the only way for most candidates to have even a chance of being viable these days. As a result, Oregon Democrats were faced with the distinct possibility of losing their first race for governor in 4 decades because of the split, which polls suggested could have allowed the Republican to win with barely 45% of the vote. And while this didn't end up happening, in a way, an even worse scenario did in the same election cycle. Christine Drazan, the Republican nominee, won the primary with less than a quarter of the vote. The fact that she came so close to winning the governorship with a relatively weak plurality after winning the primary with an even smaller plurality shows firsthand why first past the post, or choose one voting, is a terrible system and must be abolished. Although I couldn't find anything to directly confirm that the most recent gubernatorial election is what prompted Oregonians to consider this change, given what nearly resulted from it, it certainly seems likely. And while Oregon is far from the first state to vote on ranked choice voting, if they pass it, assuming no other states do between now and the 2024 election, they'd be the first state to implement RCV at a statewide level through a pathway other than the initiative. And that's what I find so fascinating about the state legislature's decision to put this on the ballot. It shows the power of the initiative and how it can lead to a snowball effect for change nationwide. We saw this with marijuana legalization. Colorado and Washington state became the first states to legalize it in 2012. And over the next 2 election cycles, 6 more states plus the District of Columbia joined them. By the time Vermont legalized pot in early 2018, they were the 9th state to approve legalization, but the first to do so through the standard legislative process. And it's safe to say there's no way in hell they would have done so if not for the fact that the initiative process, which Vermont unfortunately does not have, didn't allow for the first 8 states to pass legalization ballot measures. Now, just a decade after the first legalization initiatives were approved by voters in Colorado and Washington, half of the American population lives in a state where weed is legal. And again, this would have never happened if it weren't for several states forcing public votes on the issue, showing that public support for legalization is prominent across the country and encouraging state legislatures to get with the times. I'd argue that the recent action of the Oregon State Legislature indicates that a somewhat similar thing is happening with ranked choice voting, at least with regards to such at the state level. In 2016, Maine became the first state to implement RCV for elections, again doing so via the initiative process, and reaffirmed their decision in 2018. In 2020, Alaska voters also approved RCV, as did Nevadans in 2022, although they'll have to approve it again in 2024 if it is to become law. The fact that there has been so much movement on this issue, like there has been with legalization, is showing state legislatures that people want change, and it is forcing them to act, at least somewhat. Without these 3 states passing initiatives in support of RCV, there would have been little to no incentive for state legislatures to do so on their own. It's because of these initiatives that they're able to see the writing on the wall, that more and more initiative states are going to keep approving policies like legalization and ranked choice voting, and, well, they're politicians, so they have a vested interest in looking good to their constituencies. I mean, just look at Nevada. In the last election, when the state voted in favor of ranked choice voting, both of its Democratic senators and its then Democratic governor came out against it, and it still won. And now Democrats in Oregon are approving it to be sent to the ballot in their state, showing the momentum for this issue. And in Maine and Alaska, currently the only 2 states that use ranked choice voting statewide at any level, a strong majority of voters in both states have been able to understand the process, flying in the face of one of the right-wing arguments against RCV, that it's too complicated and a scam. Furthermore, it has been shown to increase voter turnout in cities that have used the system for a while, particularly among young voters and poor voters, whose voices are some of the most absent in government at virtually all levels. Also, RCV makes voters more likely to support third party and independent candidates, who are often ignored by the establishment media and, as a result, the voters, as just being spoilers who are there to hand over the race to the worst candidate by siphoning votes from the slightly less worse candidate. We saw this in 2016, in which several liberals are still shaming third party voters for not voting Hillary Clinton, and we're seeing it again in 2024, where they're shaming people who might want to vote for a third party candidate, such as maybe Cornel West, over Biden. You must vote Biden, they say, because it's the only way we can beat Trump. The thing about this line of thinking is, hardly any of the people who are making this argument will even advocate for ranked choice voting. They would rather shame voters instead of actually making an honest effort to reach out to them, because then they know they don't have to change anything. They can just use the fear of the other option to scare voters into supporting their milquetoast candidates. And let me be clear before anybody gets the wrong idea. I absolutely believe that Trump or DeSantis, whoever gets the nomination, is a far greater evil than Biden. That still doesn't change the fact that we shouldn't have to settle for the lesser of two evils, because that's all American voters have been doing for the longest time. That's why the ballot initiatives that have brought ranked choice voting to Maine, to Alaska, and possibly soon to Nevada are important, because they've ignited a conversation surrounding an alternative to the crappy way we vote, and have actually started a movement to implement such an alternative. It's telling vote shamers that if they really think it's important that progressives, leftists, whatever you want to call them, vote for their candidate, they must become the loudest supporters of alternative voting methods, such as ranked choice voting. And with RCV now being on the ballot in Oregon, not because of a citizen initiative, but rather because of the work of the state legislature, it is a sign that politicians are getting the memo, similar to how they have with marijuana legalization. For instance, here in my home state of Connecticut, our governor, Ned Lamont, recently came out in support of ranked choice voting, and while it wasn't able to get passed to the most recent legislative session, perhaps the votes in Nevada and Oregon, and hopefully more states in 2024, could influence the legislature to give it a greater priority next time around. None of this is to say that ranked choice voting is a perfect system. It is actually quite the opposite. There are many problems with ranked choice voting, and I'll leave a link in the description below if you're watching this on YouTube, and in the YouTube card above, to a recent live stream that kind of explains some of the problems with ranked choice voting. However, given the fact that it is clearly the most well-known and supported alternative to first past the post, it is worth fighting for, I would say. Furthermore, the fight for ranked choice voting, if it continues as it is currently, will lead to a federal victory, which could hopefully come in the form of the Fair Representation Act, which would not only require all congressional elections to be done using RCV, but would also create multi-member congressional districts and end gerrymandering to further address the lack of representation several demographics face in government. Nearly every major social reform in American history, from women's suffrage to interracial marriage to gay marriage, began at the state level. And we're seeing the exact same thing with marijuana legalization. And hopefully, at this rate, we'll soon see something similar with ranked choice voting. So in conclusion, if you live in Oregon or Nevada, make sure you vote yes for ranked choice voting in 2024. And also be on the lookout for groups in your state that might be trying to make ranked choice voting a ballot measure. Because as more states pass this, the more momentum it'll give towards a new voting system. And again, while ranked choice voting might not be perfect, at this point it's clearly the most widely known alternative to first past the post voting, which we can all agree is the absolute worst. Thank you all so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you leave a like and subscribe to the podcast. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, make sure you follow and leave a good review for the podcast. You can follow it on Facebook and Twitter. Links are down below, again, if you're on YouTube. And I will see everybody soon. I'm Alex Kawa, and this is Direct Initiative.